Hello, everybody, and welcome to VCOP. If you just tuned in, we're here with Anita Krajnc. The theme of our VCOP 17 has been the stories we tell and the games we play. And we've invited Anita to share her story because it's got a very textured kind of exploration of different approaches to activism, a recognition that we need to change to new systems. And as a doctor of political science, she's done a lot of things that haven't been very top-down oriented, very grassroots oriented. And so that's a very interesting story. I don't want to get too much into it because, Anita, this is all about you. But I've also got your slideshow presentation here when you want me to start sharing screen.
Thanks. Yeah. Hi. Thanks everyone for being here and thanks for organizing VCOP. I'd like to talk about two stories. One is bearing witness to animals at the front gates of slaughterhouses, and the second is the climate crisis and the rise of the plant-based treaty as a solution. So if you could share screen now, that would be great. So what I did for the first part of this presentation is just focusing on photos, mainly photos, and I just started with this one, Toronto Pig Save. So Toronto Pig Save started in 2010, so about 14 years ago, with the adoption of a dog, Mr. Bean. And I lived in the area 3 years earlier, and I was vegan and I was an activist, and it never occurred to me to go to the slaughterhouse. In fact, I even contacted an active group outside Toronto in Hamilton to see if those activists would come to Toronto to do outreach. But when I adopted a dog, Mr. Bean, that's when we started holding vigils. So the founder of Toronto Pig Save is really a dog, Mr. Bean. Are you able to share the slides, Ray? Thank you. So yeah, so that photo is on what we call Pig Island. It's an traffic island where the trucks would stop at a set of lights and then turn and then go a few hundred meters to the slaughterhouse. So the next shot is of Brenda bearing witness. If you can go to the next slide, please. So it was very easy and safe. Next slide, that's Mr. Bean at the front of the slaughterhouse. Next slide, you can see a person, that's Barbie bearing witness to a very frightened, terrified pig. Next slide, this photo I took to me, it looks like Mother Earth eyes, just incredible eyes, but very sad eyes. And somebody made a tattoo based on this photo. Next slide, that's Mr. Bean at the slaughterhouse. At a few hundred meters from the slaughterhouse, near just across the street from Pig Island, and people doing vegan outreach. Next slide. So the traffic island, and you see a transport truck there, was just beside what was called the exhibition, where you would have rides, amusement rides every summer. And you see an angel there on top of the Prince's Gates, and millions of pigs would pass there. So it's a very busy intersection. Next slide. And something that we learned when we were bearing witness is that every pig is an individual. And as a vegan and activist, I had a prejudice before I started bearing witness. I never really thought about it, and I thought, oh, all pigs are the same. I never really thought about the individuality of the pigs. When you bear witness, it's so obvious that they're individuals, just like the dogs and cats and other animals in your lives, and human beings in your lives. Next slide. This is Louise. Next slide, please. This is one before. This is Louise bearing witness. So she's still very active with our movement, and this was the first year we started bearing witness, 2011. Next slide. That's just since again 2011. She's very active in our movement now with the plant-based treaty. Next slide. So this is a woman who came from up north in Ontario and near Sudbury, and this was her. I don't know if that's north, but anyway, yeah, it is. She and her sister were bearing witness for the first time. Next slide. I just want to show you a few slides that just show the individuality of the pigs. And next slide shows how crowded they are. The next slide just shows when we first started doing vigils 3 a week, every week, even during the Christmas holidays. We never took a break, never canceled. In extreme weather, we would still do them because we want to show the conditions of extreme heat and extreme cold that the pigs were suffering in. We would often see very thirsty pigs. In this picture, you see the pig has sort of a bloody snout, and sort of because they're gasping for air and just and dehydrated. Next slide shows a pig gasping for air and extremely hot. Next slide, again showing the incredible beauty of these animals, and it just makes no sense, seeing them in these trucks. Next slide. It's the same pig. Next slide. It's Barbie bearing witness. She was an administrator for the Toronto Vegetarian Association, and we first started. They gave us a free table, and that helped us grow. In the early years, there were a lot of kind people that helped us. Joanne MacArthur, for example, gave us a number of her cards and helped us by taking photos at the vigils and bringing it to an international audience. Sue Coe, who's a world-renowned artist, gave us thousands of dollars of her artwork, which we sold for a fundraiser. So we were helped by so many people. And by holding, next slide, please. By holding 3 vigils a week, a lot of people eventually came. So a lot of people would say, oh, I'm too scared, I'll break down, I'll cry, I can't do it. But just by doing 3 vigils a week, people would eventually come, maybe 3 months, 6 months later. This is Jasmine, when she was a child, bearing witness. So the nice thing about bearing witness, it's a type of activism that anyone can participate in. Children, grandmothers, everyone. It's not like, it's not as risky as, like, say, going into a farm and things like that. So it's something, and it's also publicly accessible. Like, this is on public streets. Next slide, please. There's Jasmine and Mr. Bean, who would often be at the vigils there. Next slide. It just shows a pig with his ear, like a dog, just, sort of observing us. On the other side, you could see the park there. That's where Mr. Bean and the people were. So it's just the contrast of, in this dungeon, and then the first time they see light, they see this greenery in this park. Next slide, please. We would see a lot of injured animals. So just if you could just, go to the next few slides. And then next slide, just the animals have each other. They're the ones that they comfort each other. That's what we found. And, what we were trying to do is just offer, a moment of comfort or giving some water, but it's really the pigs that are comforting each other. Next slide. It's bearing witness is life transformative. In the background there, you see Layla, who's still active in our movement now with the plant-based treaty. Next slide, please. This is a former chicken slaughterhouse worker who joined us. A lot of former slaughterhouse workers joined us. Next slide, please. Next slide. We then started doing vigils at the cow slaughterhouse, and the cows would not take water from us, rarely took an apple. I only had 1 or 2 encounters of that. Like, when we would offer, I think once they took an apple from me, once some water, but most times when we offered it, they're too scared to do that, to even accept that. Next slide, please. This just shows the absolute terror of the cow. Cows can smell from 5 miles away, and when they're going to the slaughterhouse, it's extremely noisy. The skins of the murdered cows are, driven past. The blood is being rendered. It's so smelly. It's like it's really horrific for these cows. Next slide. So for the first 5 years, when we started doing 3 vigils a week, that's from 2011 to 2015, we grew from 1 group to 35 groups. almost immediately, a group in Burlington started within months of us doing vigils. Like we started in July of 2011 doing 3 vigils a week. In September, there was already another group in Burlington that started at Fearman's. That's where Regan Russell was tragically killed. Then there was a group that started in Melbourne and the US, and a few groups started, 35. But then after this pig trial, where I got arrested for giving water to thirsty pigs, it was a 2-year trial, and then we got a lot more support, and we also got resources for the first time. And what we did with the funding was we prioritized sending organizing teams around the world to spread it. And then it grew, in the next 5 years, it grew from 35 groups to over 1,000. So it just shows the power of, it's similar to the labor movement. If groups like Unite here invest 25% of the resources in organizing drives, and that's why groups like Unite Here or SCIO, the Service Employees International Union, which represents security guards, janitors, doctors, healthcare providers, is the fastest growing union in the US because they put a significant part of their budget towards organizing drives. So we were, when I was teaching at Queen's, I sort of applied some of the things that we had learned about how to build a movement to Toronto Pig Save and the Save movement. So some of the lessons were stage frequent direct actions. Hence, we had 3 vigils a week, every week. Community organizing, love-based organizing, connecting with other movements. So we were pro-worker. We looked at slaughterhouse workers as victims. And in addition to the primary victims, the animals, the non-human animals. We drew other lessons on how to organize. Some of the techniques we used to get new people to vigils is we started doing all-day vigils, and once we even did a 30-hour vigil at the cow slaughterhouse where people camped out. And so that was a stronger form of bearing witness, because you'd sort of, like, sometimes the cows were held in the pen areas, and so just sleeping there and sort of really being as close as we could be was very transformative for a lot of people as well. Okay, next slide, please. This is going home with the signs, and we have the comfort of, bearing witness, which is very difficult. It's like you're going to hell, and observing. It's like a war zone. It's like a battleground, where all these beautiful, innocent animals go to the slaughterhouse and don't come out alive. They come out in packages, and as difficult as it is for everybody, and it's very traumatizing, it's just, we get to go home. We get to go to a nice home. We get to eat. We get to, it's an incredible privilege. And it's very difficult, to think about what the animals have to go through. So the next part of the presentation, I'd like to focus on is the plant-based treaty. So we pivoted in, I'd say, at about around 2017. I mean, Ray Kowalczyk was part of that pivot. We started a Climate Save movement, and we were doing various actions, trying to get people aware of the climate crisis. But it was a bit difficult when we first started doing that. And maybe Ray knows the exact date, but it was around the mid 2015 or something like that. But it was difficult because there wasn't a lot of traction, and we started Health Save movement as well. So we had Animal Save movement, Climate Save movement, Health Save movement. And we were sort of finding it difficult to develop a strategy. And that sort of changed in April 2021, if you can go to the next slide. We met with Sephora Berman. She's the founder of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I had known her in the 90s because I got arrested twice under her leadership. She was the blockade coordinator for Clackwood Sound, Old Growth Rainforest, and also the Great Bear Rainforest. And so I knew her since the 90s. And so we called her up in 2021 and said, how do we put animal farming on the global agenda? So she showed us the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and we really liked it. So we basically copied it and have since adapted it a bit. So we published our first detailed report called Safe and Just at the last COP last year. And so if you'd like to take a look, you can just, point at the QR code and download it, or just go to plantbasedtreaty.org and you can get a copy of it. Next slide, please. I think is it zoomed? I don't know if it's zoomed in, or is it? Is it fine? I think it's okay. I don't know, Ray. Ray, do you know if it's zoomed in slightly or there? Okay. So yeah, so this slide. So what we did in our report is we used the the donut economics framework to try to understand, how to move forward after assessing the problem in terms of two things: the planetary boundaries and also the social foundations. So the outer rim shows the planetary boundaries, the 9 planetary boundaries, and then the inner rim is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but in our case, we put the food system there instead. And on the right of the photo, you see Kate Raworth, who wrote the book Donut Economics in 2017. She was very critical of neoclassical economics, which posits endless growth and doesn't consider climate and social justice in its models. It tends to think of them as externalities. So she developed this donut economics, which is more of a circular economy and is intersectional. Next slide, please. So the planetary boundaries are defined as environmental ceilings that are we need to respect in order to ensure the long-term survival of life on the planet. So it's about regulating stability and resilience on the planet. And 6 of the 9 boundaries have been breached, and 4 of them have surpassed the high risk boundary. So the areas in red. So you can see their climate, novel entities, biosphere integrity, and biogeochemical flows. That's phosphorus and nitrogen. Next slide, please. So this slide, it just shows that article that was published, journal article last year called Earth Beyond 6 of the 9 Planetary Boundaries. And so the authors include Johan Rockström, and the lead author is Catherine Richardson. Next slide. So Johan Rockström and his team issued 3 sort of assessments of planetary boundaries. So in 2009, they found that 3 boundaries were crossed, but the gray areas are areas where they weren't able to put numerical data. So they may have been transgressed then, but there was no data at that point. In 2015, 4 boundaries were crossed, and 2023, 6. By that time, they had numbers for those 2 areas that were previously in gray. Next slide, please. So I'm just drawing on a presentation that happened yesterday where Kimmy Cushman and SG presented on some more details from the Safe and Just report, and they sort of gave a visual representation of what Rockström and team have done in terms of assigning numbers to the problem. So in the case of land use systems, you see the first column, that is the global sort of status of forests. And the dot is in the yellow sort of zone where it's surpassed the boundary. It's beyond the safe boundary. And then the next few columns, you see different types of forests and different areas of the world. And in some cases, like for the tropical forests, you see in Asia, it's in the red zone. In Africa, it's in the red zone. And for the Americas, it's in the yellow zone. So it's past the boundaries. Same is true for temperate. It's past the boundaries, and the boreal forest as well. So that's the current status of land use change, planetary boundary. And these were quantified in 2023. The next slide, please. So this was one of the most important findings of Joseph Poor's research of where he looked at 40,000 farms and found that 83% of farmland is used for animal agriculture. but it only produces 18% of calories. So it's extremely inefficient. And in his words, moving from current diets to a diet that excludes animal products has transformative potential, reducing land use by 3.1 billion hectares or a 76% reduction. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the last 24,000 years, and the most recent 11,000 years are highlighted in green and are known as the Holocene, where human civilization began to quote unquote thrive. It's characterized by very steady temperature, but now it's being disrupted by human activity. In the very far right region, you see the rapid rise in temperature because of human activity. So next slide, please. So this chart appeared in our Safe and Just report, and it's a really, really important chart. So the green bar that you see there is the 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius warming. And it shows that 5 tipping points are especially at high risk, even with 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius warming. If you go beyond 2 degrees warming, you see the tipping points that are at high risk. So in this graph, you see 16 of the world's tipping points. There are more tipping points, but these are some of the key tipping points that we face. So it is because of these tipping points that Johan Rockström said 1.5 degrees is a physical limit, not a political target. Next slide, please. This just shows in more detail some of the tipping points. And in the red, you can see the tipping points that are more sensitive to climate change. And these are the ones that pose high risk in the near future. Next slide, please. So with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it has 3 working groups. The first is on the science, and that's what we just covered, the tipping points and things like that. The second working group looks at impacts, and the third one looks at policy responses. So here we focus on some of the impacts of climate change and how it's experienced in different countries. The map shows precipitation projections by the end of the century, and some of the areas will experience more frequent and severe droughts. Other regions will suffer from heavy rains and flooding. According to the International Disaster Database, 1.6 million people have experienced flooding in 2023. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the status of climate change, again, with numbers. And so when you look at that original sort of planetary boundary diagram, it was broken into 2 for some of the areas, like for nitrogen, phosphorus. Also with climate change, it had 2 indicators that they were looking at. So here again, you can see that we're in the high risk zone in terms of the carbon budget, and then in terms of radiative forcing, we're in the red zone. Okay, next slide, please. So climate change and its relationship to animal agriculture is that, first of all, there are indirect emissions and the destruction of sinks, and we're losing the ability of trees to act as carbon sinks because of the deforestation from animal feed and cattle ranching. And then there are also the direct emissions, methane, nitrous oxide, and also carbon dioxide in terms of transportation and things. Next slide, please. So one of the biggest concerns is methane. And in our report, Steve George, who wrote the first chapter mainly, found that about almost half of the warming that has occurred to date is from methane. So almost half of the 1.1, 1.2 degrees warming that we've had is from methane. There are 3 billion cows and sheep on the planet. And 32% of all emissions come from animal agriculture. And when you add food waste and everything else, it's even higher, because a lot of the emissions from food waste is from animal ag as well. One of the ways in sort of considering the impact of methane is to look at its effect over 100 years. And if you do look at it over 100 years, it is 28 times as strong as CO2. But if you look at it a shorter time period, like 10 years or 20 years, then its impact is much higher. It's a short-lived gas, but the half-life is around 10 years, and for carbon dioxide, it's hundreds of years, even 1,000 years. Methane is much more potent. So it's very important to actually calculate the impact on a shorter time frame, because we're already at 1.2 degrees warming, and we're heading towards 1.5 and 2 degrees in the next few years or decades. So it's not relevant to look at a time frame that's 100 years. So if you look at the next slide, the top chart, it looks like CO2 is the most important gas over a 100-year time frame. But if you look at a time frame that's shorter, like 20 years, then methane is almost as significant as carbon dioxide. And that's what we found was one of the most important sort of lessons, or that we need to consider. And there is a methane emergency, and not enough is being done to address it. And usually when there are policies, they do not focus on animal agriculture in terms of reducing the numbers of animals or switching to a plant-based food system. Next slide, please. So again, for biosphere integrity, there are 2 indicators that they looked at. So on the left side, it's the number of extinctions of species per million species, which currently is over 100 species. And so it is in the high risk category. So that is, each year there's more than 100 species per million species going extinct, which is, it's, I'd say, sort of a crime against nature. The right side shows a measure known as net primary production. Basically, it measures net carbon gain by plants or human impacts on the Earth's natural life cycles. And it's also in the red zone. Next slide, please. So the 2 core boundaries, climate change and biosphere integrity, are interconnected and self-reinforcing. So when they look at the planetary boundaries, they sort of, all of them are important in terms of the long-term survival of life on the planet, but some of them are more fundamental, and two of those are climate change and biosphere integrity. As climate change worsens, and the world becomes hotter, drier, and rainier in other parts, the wildlife and species will also leave their climate niche and may not be able to survive. At the same time, the reduction in biosphere integrity can impact how well ecosystems can sequester carbon. So they're interconnected there. Next slide. So this is a now familiar slide to you at Climate Healers. So there are 8 billion humans, 92 billion land animals that are being bred and killed each year, 1 trillion or more, or some say over 2 trillion sea animals killed each year. And as you can see, the figure shows that only about 4% of all mammal biomass comes from wild mammals, whereas humans make up 8%, eight times more than that, and farmed animals make a staggering 62% of mammal biomass. So the vast majority of animals in the food system take a toll on the integrity of the biosphere as a whole. It's just shocking in our lifetime, how those numbers have shifted. Next slide, please. And this just shows the other impacts, some of the other impacts of animal agriculture. So for example, its impact on freshwater use, how the fertilization of feed crops results in nitrogen pollution, contributing to the breaching of biogeochemical flows, ocean acidification and eutrophication. And then it also shows how factory farms also pose a risk to health and biodiversity because of zoonotic diseases and antibiotic resistance. Next slide, please. So when we use the donut economics as a framework, we looked at the outer 9 planetary boundaries and the role of animal agriculture. And then for the inner rim, we used our 3 R's. So we have like 3 R principles for the plant-based treaty. Don't make the problem worse, relinquish. 2 is redirect, like redirect economic policies. And 3 is restore or reforest the earth and things like that. And we had like 40 detailed proposals, but in this case, we just picked 12 just to make it manageable. And Kate Raworth did the same thing. There are many sustainable development goals, but she just picked 12 to go in the inner rim of the donut. So, so in our case here, the inner rim represents the plant-based treaty social foundations of the food system. Next slide. So the first one is no land use change. So currently, 4 billion hectares are being used for farming. But if people went plant-based, that would be reduced 75% to 1 billion. So that's an incredible, opportunity to reforest and rewild the earth. Next slide, please. And here's another example of that. And this is also from Joseph Poor. Producing dairy milk involves 10 times as much land as oat milk. And then the other columns show also acidification, eutrophication, and land use, and water use, and greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. In terms of indigenous protection, indigenous people represent 5% of the world's population, and they safeguard 80% of the planet's biodiversity. Yet they are disproportionately targeted and killed as land defenders. So we found the Global Witness nonprofit found that 43% of land defenders that were killed were indigenous peoples. Global Witness in 2022 also found that agribusiness was the main killer of land defenders, the #1 killer, even above mining. Next slide. Another principle or another call to action is ban live exports. So about 5 million animals are shipped around the world each day. And that number has been growing since the 60s. So the trajectory has just been going up and up. And, it results in incredible exploitation and suffering of the animals. And they usually start their long journeys on a transport truck before going on the ship, and often without food and water. Inside the trucks and ships, animals are forced to stand where they urinate and defecate. Their bodies are covered with feces, and many develop a fever, diarrhea, and vomiting. And many of them die on the journey. And what we found was that the reason that live export is increasing is because as more countries become water scarce, they are then going to countries that do have water, and the animals are bred and are grow to a certain age, and then they're shipped and then slaughtered as at 16 months for cows, or in the countries where they're shipped, often to the Middle East. Next slide, please. Food security. So in this social boundary, what we found was that People facing chronic hunger was going down, but then it sort of went up again, and now it's about 735 million in people face chronic hunger in 2022. So animal agriculture is inefficient system to feed the global population because you have to feed 92 billion land animals while there is hunger in terms of the human population. So for example, Greenpeace found that 62% of cereal crops in Europe were used to feed animals. Next slide, please. So when we were looking at food security, we also looked at the concept of climate niche. There are quite a few journal articles on this, and it's about climate migrants. It's about how at a certain temperature, it becomes unlivable. So the temperature, I think, is around 28, 29 degrees Celsius. And more and more of the population is living in areas where that's the average temperature. And so some of the issues that arise are water scarcity, crop failure, accelerated spread of diseases, and heat-related deaths from increasing temperatures. So we found one study that said it is estimated that crop failure will increase by 4.5, factor 4.5 by 2030. The IPCC in its 2022 report found that mass migration of climate refugees would lead to land conflict along with failing infrastructure. And this might result in more political instability. A 2023 report found that over 600 million people have already been displaced from the climate niche. And so some journal articles project, by the end of this century, it could be 1 billion, it could be several billion people that are going to leave their climate niche. Next slide, please. So one of the things we were also looking at for this report was meat consumption, as well as global per capita consumption. And so here you can see the trends. This is from Our World in Data. So global meat consumption from 1961 to 2013. And then with projections to 2050. So you can see eggs, the orange area there are goats and sheep. Sorry, sheep, yeah, goats and sheep. Then you see cows, pigs, and birds. And then there was a recent study by the Harvard Law School Animal Law and Policy Program. It came out last month, and they suggested that animal agriculture emissions must peak by 2030 to avoid 2 degrees warming. So there's that white line bar there that you can see that's where it should peak, but the projections are that they will keep on increasing. So unless major, policy changes are made. The next slide, please. This was one of the most disturbing findings that we found, the previous slide, in writing this report, and that's per capita meat consumption globally has gone up from about 30 kilograms per person in 1980 to 45 kilograms by the early 20s. There's just a small dip during COVID, but it's sort of back up. And that's a 50% increase. And we know that this growth in meat production and consumption has had devastating impacts on the world's forests, fresh water, biodiversity, eutrophication, and ocean dead zones, soil degradation, climate, public health, and of course the animals and wildlife. So there's an urgent need to transform the global food system to plant-based. And this is as important, if not more important, as ending fossil fuel use. Next slide, please. So a fifth social boundary or social foundation we looked at is education. And we found a poll called the People's Climate Vote, which is the largest poll on climate ever conducted. And one of the things they looked at is the relationship between food and climate change. And they found that people were unaware and what they called an awareness gap. When people were presented with possible solutions to the climate crisis in terms of on an individual level, they chose diet change as the least important out of 18 choices, even though it was the most important in terms of having the biggest impact. There's also an issue with media. I think Faunalytics did a study that showed that there's very little coverage of animal agriculture in climate news. In terms of solutions, New York City, for example, launched a public awareness campaign. It was only 1 month, unfortunately, but it was called Eat a Whole Lot More Plants. So they were encouraging eating, plant-based, whole foods, plant-based. Next slide, please. Another thing we're looking at is health, antibiotic resistance. I'm just going to go quicker through this because I want to have a discussion. And then the next one is showing zoonotic diseases and pandemics. We looked at that in some detail. The next slide on health as well. We want to emphasize, what the plant-based health professionals in the UK have developed. They call this the plant-based Eat Well Guide. So the Eat Well Guide is sort of the official guide in the UK, and they did a fully plant-based version of it. And they show the proportion of foods in which different food groups are needed to achieve a balanced and healthy diet from ages 1 and above. The World Health Organization suggests that people eat at least 5 portions of a variety of fruits and vegetables a day, but what we should aim for more at eating 10 portions a day. That is double the amount because it has additional benefits. And that's what we get from this plant-based Eat Well Guide. Next slide, please. There's also the issue of transparency and honest labeling. And we know that, for example, Cargill employs a team of lawyers in Washington where their only job is to try to prevent labeling because they don't want labels to say made in Brazil so that we know it's coming from deforested areas because they know it would impact people. So next slide, please. Financing plant-based systems. In terms of global subsidies, a report from the Food and Agriculture Organization and UNEP, UNDP, United Nations Development Program, as well as UNEP, found that 87% of global food subsidies are harmful to the environment and human health. And in terms of subsidies for plant-based, there was a 2023 study of the US and Europe, and it found that meat and dairy alternatives make up 1.5% of market share, but they only received 0.1% of subsidies. So it just shows you how unfair it is and how governments are subsidizing, the killing of our planet. Next slide, please. Reforestation and rewilding. As mentioned earlier, if people switch to a plant-based food system worldwide, we could reduce land use by 75%. Next slide, please. Greening cities. So again, the Rockstrom team was able to develop or come up with some numbers in terms of what is required for cities for insects to be able to move from one area to another. And they found in their safe and just Earth system boundary framework that 20 to 25% of every 1 square kilometer of urban environments have to be covered in greenery. It's also important to have locally produced fruits and vegetables in cities. And currently, a lot of cities lack sufficient numbers of community and rooftop gardens. Next slide, please. Food justice is absolutely essential in terms of human rights, particularly with respect to animal agriculture. There are human rights violations. Slaughterhouse workers suffer from depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, one of the highest rates of injury in any industry. And according to the International Labor Organization, around 24,000 fishers are killed every year. Again, the solutions are to shift to a plant-based food system and provide families with healthy, accessible food. Next slide, please. Land equity is a really important issue, and Rockstrom and his co-author, they say in one of the final chapters that, we need to work on expanding the global commons, or what is considered the global commons. And there is a serious issue of land inequity. Ultra-rich people and institutions often are corrupt and use coercion. So, for example, 9% of Africa's land has been bought or seized since 2000. Today, 70% of the world's farmland is owned or controlled by just 1% of its quote-unquote farmers, who are often absentee or just corporations. So we need to shift land ownership into community hands so it can be repurposed for reforestation, green space, and edible gardens. Next slide, please. So just the last few slides are just, what the plant-based treaty is, its mission. Basically, it is to shift to a plant-based food system so that we can live within our planetary boundaries. And our long-term vision is to have a global treaty that's part of the UN framework. Next slide, please. And we have these 3R principles. And as I mentioned earlier, where we want to focus on preventing the planetary crisis from getting worse. We want to redirect and shift to a plant-based food system using economic instruments like taxes, subsidies, as well as public information campaigns and regulations. And then the third R is restore, reforest the earth. Then we have some detailed proposals on our website. Next slide, please. We have 5 main programs. So we collect endorsements, or our theory of change is to collect endorsements from individuals, groups, and businesses to create pressure for change. We have a city program. We have menu change. We go to the global climate talks, and then training and capacity building. Next slide, please. So far we have about 150,000 individuals that have endorsed, over 3,000 businesses and groups, in 27 cities. Next slide, please. It's really easy to endorse. You just go to the homepage and you can endorse as an individual, group, business, or city there. Next slide, please. That's the QR code to endorse. Or just go to plantbasedtreaty.org, and I'd really appreciate it if everybody could endorse. Next slide just shows the 27 cities that have endorsed. So you see LA, Amsterdam, Edinburgh, Didim in Turkey, a number of cities in India. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we do to get city endorsements is go through these 10 steps. So we set up a team, we email counselors, we map the city to see how we can form a coalition with environmental, climate justice, social justice, worker, student groups. We have messaging, we do some direct actions, we do some actions in front of city halls. We meet with counselors, we do presentations, we develop partnerships, we do depositions. So if you go to our YouTube channel, you'll see probably about 100 depositions already that people do in front of City Hall. We launch petitions, and then we follow up with post-endorsement and try to get an action plan. Next slide, please. So we have welcoming calls every Friday, 10 and 2 p.m. EST. So if you want to get sort of the basics of what you need to do to be an advocate, or to start a team, just please join our welcoming call. The next slide is just the report you can download. And yeah, that's the last slide. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Anita. Ray, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Anita. You presented the Safe and Just report with Stephen George a few VCOPs ago, and there seems to be a lot more here. You obviously have some people working to convey all this information, and I highly recommend people go and watch the previous one as well, because it covers a lot of ground. You managed to cover a lot in this hour. We have a few minutes left for questions. Does anybody in the audience have any questions? Just raise your hand. Willow jumped right up.
Go ahead, Willow.
Wonderful presentation. I live south of Austin, Texas. And my question is, I saw at the end that you have a procedure and events that volunteers can participate in to expand the work. My question is, we do not have a lot of activists here, so action is not something in the board. But my thinking is, if I work on finding places to present this presentation that you just did, can you help with that? We really need to educate our town here, and I would like to know what would be the most direct, fast way that we can show this information to the public. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So we have these Friday calls, welcoming calls. I'd strongly recommend you join one. They're every Friday, 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. EST. And we give you a lot of resources that you could use. And I put the presentation that I just did now in the chat, and it has speaking notes and everything. But we have many different presentations, shorter versions. That was a very sort of technical one that was just on the Safe and Just report and the donut economics. But we have ones that are geared towards cities that might just have a few slides from there. So yeah, we have tailored slides depending on who you're presenting to. But this is a good one just to sort of, this is a very overview of like the problem and the solutions. But yeah, it'd be also, 150,000 people endorse the treaty. So we could find out like if there are people in your town or city that have endorsed, and then sometimes we do special newsletters. If you want to organize something, we say, hey, Willow's organizing something. Do you want to join her? So we can do that.
Just a quick observation. We're at the VCOP, which stands for Vegan Conference Convergence of the Peoples. A bit of a riff off of the COP summits, the conference of the parties, and part of it is born out of a frustration that we're not seeing enough things happen at the national level. I just want to point out that the plant-based treaty has approached things at the municipal level, engaging with cities and encountering like a completely different attitude towards climate change, which is pretty encouraging.
Yeah, go ahead, Debbie. You're muted.
Will it let me? Now it will let me.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm curious about why the plant-based movement, our movement, and the let's limit human population to 8 billion by educating women and promoting economic development. Why do we avoid each other? I've talked to population people who don't mention climate, and I wonder if we feel that by transforming the world to a plant-based one, can we have as many humans as the world can possibly hold? Because we humans do use up things besides foodstuffs. And it seems to me it would be like there'd be some natural meeting points, but they don't seem to be any. It's interesting.
So yeah, I mean, when I read, say, donut economics, like there's definitely a correlation, as you said, with education and women empowerment and the reduction in the number of children. I
think Anita presented that data, no? You presented that data in, so when you show that 4% is wild animals, 32% is human beings, and 62% or whatever is farmed animals.
Right, farmed.
She's implicitly saying that there are too many of us, really. Because, yeah, you have to get rid of the farmed animals. But even if you get rid of all the farmed animals, if you look at the total weight of human beings alone, one species, we exceed the weight of all the other mammals by a factor of 8, right? And even if you bring the mammals back to what they were 10,000 years ago, we are still double the weight of all the wild animals that lived 10,000 years ago. So clearly, in the long run, this human population is not sustainable in the long run. Temporarily, the Earth will tolerate it because the Earth has been actually feeding another 60, all the farmed animals she's been feeding, right? So she'll have relief from that. So I said temporarily we need a huge human population because there is a lot of cleanup work to be done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Once you get our act together and do the cleanup, then we can start reducing the population.
Yeah, do the cleanup, help all rather than build yourself a palace.
Right. There you go. That's a good story to tell.
Thank you.
With that, thank you so much, Anita. It was comprehensive and again, very inspiring work that you do.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Alash, and thank you, everyone.